In previous modules, we've talked a little bit about active listening skills, and we want to build on that here. I asked you in one of the pre-assessments whether or not it was possible to begin or build on a relationship during a crisis. And the answer to that question is yes, it's absolutely true that crisis, strangely, can be a time when we actually can strengthen a relationship. If you think about times when you've been in crisis, there were people that you called upon, that you trusted, that helped you to get through those crises. And in the aftermath of those crises, you probably felt grateful and closer and more trusting of those people. So if you think about the interventions that we do through stages 1, 2, and 3 of the arousal cycle, we're really doing things that should be constructive toward a relationship as well as responsive to a relationship. For example, in stage 1, a trusting and reliable friend or coworker or professional will help that person by guiding the client to use their own powers of judgment and their own communication skills to navigate through that mild stressor. As they get into level 2 and they're starting to exhibit or feel more moderate arousal, well, the caregiver switches gears slightly and becomes more directive, but still is being directive in a way that's clearly client-centered and very supportive. And then in stage 3, the caregiver's approach still gives that client what they need, or that family member what they need, whether it's creating space or quiet, whether it's giving them time to process what's going on and allowing their natural defense to help them calm down. So all the way through this process are opportunities for us to strengthen relationship. And it's important for us to have strong communication skills with individuals at the best of times, but it's even more important to have strong communication skills with individuals in the most challenging of times. And I call these door openers. Door openers are simply invitations to communicate when a person is being nonverbal, when they're not sure, it looks to you like they're not sure that they can actually tell you what's going on. Because as many of us who've raised small children know, if children don't use their words, they sometimes act out. And so it's a real basic truism that we want to help people use their words. And we do that by following a simple 4-step process. First of all, we start by being what we call concrete. And that just means we start by describing the person's body language. And when I say we describe what their body language looks like, what I mean is we literally start by saying what we saw them do. Don't jump ahead to tell them how you perceive that behavior or what you think it meant. So it might be, I noticed that you stepped forward, or I noticed that you began to say something there, or I noticed that you were looking at me, or I noticed that you came out of your room, or I noticed you put your hand up. Any of those things are physical behaviors that may communicate that an individual wants to say something. The second step is simply to tell the person that you interpreted that behavior as a possible invitation to speak. So you're going to verbally invite that person to speak, saying something like, would you like to say something? Or does that mean you want to say something? Or if you want to say something, I'd like to hear it. Our third element is simply to be silent. And we're going to use our body language, and we're going to talk about this more in a moment, to allow that person to know that we're waiting eagerly but without putting pressure on them. Remember, if this is a person who's dealing with developmental disabilities, drug addiction issues, mental health symptoms, they may need more time to process in their own right. Give them medications, that processing time may actually become even larger, and then put them under stress, and that processing time is even larger yet again. So use wait time. And often when I deal with people or my colleagues, they think that they are somehow being helpful by saying to the person, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, or words to that effect, or I'm listening, I'm listening. But every time they do that without knowing it, they're resetting the clock for that person's wait time back to the beginning. And they would be far better to use nonverbal cues as a way of letting the person know that you're still interested in hearing what they say, as opposed to verbal cues. So we're going to attend physically. Let the person see our body language, our eye contact, our gestures are telling the person that we really are willing to listen. So we have to use these in combination for the greatest effect. If we don't, then they're going to simply seem artificial. And it's strange because we have to practice doing this in order to seem natural. Many of us don't do these things habitually. And so we need to go from being an unconscious incompetent, in other words, a person who doesn't know when they're doing the wrong thing, to a unconscious competent. I'll get it out. To an unconscious competent, which simply means we have to speak in a way that's natural for us, but happens to be effective. And how do we get that way? Well, first by learning what we're doing wrong, then by learning what we're doing right, and then by doing the right thing over and over and over again until it becomes habitual. One of the most important things that we can do is demonstrate a skill called reciprocity. Reciprocity is comparable to playing tennis. When a person hits a ball over the net to us, if we don't return it in kind, the tennis match pretty quickly ends. In fact, if a person keeps hitting the ball over the net and we can't return it even some of the time, it's quite likely the other individual is going to simply give up on the tennis match. And that's exactly what happens in conversation. We're looking for reciprocity. We're looking for people to return in kind what we send to them. And there are a variety of ways that we do this. The first is called voice matching. And voice matching is a bit of a misleading term because it suggests that when an individual speaks, we use the same voice that they use, when in fact we don't. There are some voices that are sending voices and some voices that are receiving voices. For example, when an individual walks in the room and says, "I'm really frustrated with Johnny. I can't believe he did that to my favorite possession." We don't match his voice and say, "Yeah, it sounds like you're really angry. Tell me what happened." No, instead we match his voice using a catching voice or receiving voice that sounds like this. "Wow, what happened?" So that voice tone really tells the person that you're taking them seriously. It's a dramatic tone, but it's a softer tone. And what's beautiful about using that tone is it tends to have the other person now reciprocate back to us. And gradually, as the tennis match goes back and forth, you could sort of graphically imagining that tone losing its tension and getting down to a more conversational tone. If we don't use the appropriate tone, if somebody walks in the room and says, "I can't believe Johnny just did that to my favorite possession," and your tone back to them is something like this, "What happened?" The person is going to feel like they actually need to escalate the tone of their voice, the volume of their voice, the cadence and rhythm of their voice to let you know just how serious it is. And so what we need to show to them is a responsive tone that communicates that we understand. And again, this may be something that you need to practice. The studies around this are very, very interesting, both facial expressions and voice tones, that some people as a natural state automatically reply in a way that implies to others that they're listening well. It's just their natural vocal tone. They have inflections in their voices and so forth. But other people just naturally don't have that, and they have to practice it. They have to actually make a point of using those tones at times like this. We also have to make sure we use open posture and mirroring. So open posture simply means we do not have our arms crossed in front of us. We do not have things covering our face, like for example sunglasses or the visor of a cap. We do not put big objects in between ourselves and the other person. Now, if it's a safety issue, then sometimes, as we were talking about earlier, we do have to have barriers. But normally we wouldn't be trying to have a long conversation with somebody in a safety issue situation. We also want to use mirroring. So, for example, if a person is leaning forward when we're talking to them, or when they're talking to us, I should say, we tend to lean forward. When a person leans back in their chair, we do the same thing. We want to be free in our movements. When somebody's using their hands, we often use our hands. And when we watch people from across a room having a conversation, we can often tell how in tune people are, for example, on a date, by how much of this mirroring is going on. The man leans forward on the table and puts his hands in his head on his hands, and the woman does the same thing. We can all tell she's really interested in him, and then vice versa. So we need to make sure that we are employing this mirroring technique as well. And we need to use something called minimal encouragers. We talked about these in the pretest. Minimal encouragers is just a fancy way of talking about all the little tones and sounds and gestures that we use to tell people that we're paying attention. And they're particularly important when a person is speaking at length. And I can tell you, as I'm doing this course, it's very, very odd to talk to a computer or to a microphone and there's nobody giving me any kind of minimal encouragement or reciprocity as we go through this. The next time you watch the news, pay attention to a time when they're interviewing an individual and the person is giving a lengthy answer. What you may notice is that the camera will cut away from the person giving that lengthy answer, and while the voice track will continue, they will show a shot of the reporter holding the microphone to the person and nodding their head or making a similar gesture, and then they'll quickly go back to the person speaking. Now, it's interesting that they do that, but it reflects an understanding of how people communicate. Because the truth of the matter is that they actually shoot that footage of the reporter listening attentively later on. They only have one camera when they're doing these interviews, but they know that if they don't cut that person listening in, it will seem like a very artificial communication. So they make it look like a reciprocal or two-person communication by splicing in that footage after a few seconds. And we need to think those same ways. If we aren't giving these little minimal encouragers, these little propellers of conversation as we go along, then the other individual is not going to know that we're still with them. And it's funny because when I was a kid, the expression we had for this in my neighborhood, which was a somewhat rough neighborhood, was that we called these hell yeahs. And somebody would speak to you, and while they were speaking, other people would be saying, yeah, you're right, hell yeah, or you betcha, which was a kind of a young person's way of saying, we're with you, we're with you. And it wasn't entirely different than what's going on with minimal encouragers. Paraphrasing is something we've talked about before, so we'll just quickly summarize by saying when people come to natural pauses in their communication, those are like checkpoints, and we want to repeat back to people in our own words a summarized or shortened version of what they said, where we're focusing on both the meaning and, more importantly, the feeling of what they're saying, the content and the feeling. And if we do that, it tells that person, very similar to those minimal encouragers, that we're still tuned into them. So here's a visual very quickly of a person using their open posture and a pose that might be mirrored. We've also talked about questioning. When we do questioning, we remember that we need to use open-ended questions, generally speaking, and they need to be what we call supporting open-ended questions. In other words, they need to be questions that are thematically in tune with what the person is saying. We're going to talk about the opposite of these kinds of questions in a moment. They're called detour questions. And detour questions often sound like this. Imagine a person is telling you about something very sad in their life, and instead of telling them that you understand that they're sad and asking how they're coping with their sadness and asking whether or not there are things you can do to help them with that area, instead you start asking questions about the specific details of the event in their life. Those questions, while they're quite common, are actually detour questions, and they communicate to the other individual, I'm not interested in listening. If I'm dealing with a person whose anxiety is very, very high, then I might need to switch to closed-ended questions, because closed-ended questions are far simpler to ask, and far simpler to answer, I should say. So if a person is having difficulty with open-ended questions, it can be an indicator to you that they're more aroused, and we should either stop asking questions at all or move to questions that are very simple and closed-ended. And if you've forgotten what a closed-ended question is, a closed-ended question is a question that has limited options, and an open-ended question is a question that has an unlimited number of options. So open-ended questions, for example, sound like this: how are you, or how can I help you? Whereas a closed-ended question would ask something like this: are you upset? Which of course has a limited number of options, yes or no. Or would you like me to take something to the store for you, or would you like me to stay here with you? That's a two-option question, so that's a closed-ended question. When questioning people, we want to make sure that we do what we can to reduce stimuli, and so we want to isolate that person, particularly from other people. And if you work with youth, especially males, but not just males, I can tell you how important it is to have that individual get away from other youth, because they often feel as though they need to save face or put up the good fight in front of other people. Getting them away from others is key to having that person be more genuine with you and less defensive with you. And go to a setting that's more neutral or even is more comfortable and suited to the individual. If you're going to offices or official spaces, then people often feel as though they're being pressured or disciplined, even though you're not trying to do that. As before, allow processing time when giving people questions. And reflect on the behavior of the people. Be concrete. So as we talked about, when we're paraphrasing or responding to people, the answers that they're giving are not always verbal. And it's amazing how often I hear people say to an individual, do you want to leave or do you want to stay here? And the person throws themselves down on the chair and crosses their arms, and the staff person says, well, which is it? Well, the client's already answered. And I think it's easier and better if we show that person we're in tune with them by saying something like this: Okay, I can see that that probably means you want to stay here, so let me go off and make sure I make those arrangements. Let me create some quiet for you, for example. And that is going to be received by the individual as being much more client-centered, much more dignified, much more tuned in, and they're going to be far more likely to be compliant and trusting of you as a result. We have to avoid flag words, as we've said in the past, and if you haven't thought about those flag words from the prior exercises, here are again some of the key ones without going on at length. Avoid talking about rules and policy. Avoid words that imply judgment, such as why not, should, and avoid words that imply no, like don't or no itself. Avoid words that are absolutes, like never and always. Avoid talking about you, instead talk about I where possible. Avoid the word but, and avoid jargon if possible. Words like appropriate behavior, which are very abstract, are also to be avoided. Know your personal hang-ups. Before we get into these conversations with people, it's important for us to know what things automatically get our goat and step back from them. So for example, I worked with individuals that had a bias against medication. So when a client would come and ask to get a PRN medication because they were becoming agitated, often the staff person would try to talk them out of it. And it was a real uphill battle for me trying to get my staff sometimes to understand that that consumer was being very, very functional, being very good in self-care, at recognizing the symptoms of them being agitated and making a good choice about utilizing a medication. The doctor had prescribed it and the individual had wanted it, and those two people frankly superseded what the staff person thought. The staff person needed to step back and use judgment that was more client-centered, and when they did that, they were far more likely to do things that were aligned with what the client wanted and avoid further conflicts. Don't interrupt people, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why that's an issue in a moment. Avoid detour questions, as we spoke about in the last slide. And detour questions are simply questions that take the person away from the main subject. They're often focused on minutiae and details that don't matter, and as a result, the person just simply concludes that you're a waste of time to talk to, that you're not tuned into them, and they won't talk to you at all. Now, the big problem with that is if they don't have anybody else to talk to, it's not going to stop them from communicating. What they're going to do is communicate non-verbally, and this is when we start to see aggressive or self-injurious behaviors. Don't derail. We don't want the other person to derail, and derailing simply means the person has difficulty sticking to the subject. It's often a symptom of some mental disorders. A person seems to have derailed speech or derailed thought, and what that simply means is they're scattered. They're all over the place. If we do that, then we are going to imply to the other person that it's okay for them to do it. So we want to really be focused. Don't change the subject. Don't use humor to try and avoid an unpleasant topic. Sometimes that temptation can be strong, but it's better for us to be efficient in the time we're taking this communication. Talk about the matter directly and briefly. We've talked about door openers, but there are also door closers. Door closers are ineffective response styles that communicate, I don't want to listen to you. They end the current communication, and more importantly, they discourage future communication, which will often have the person describing their feelings in ways that are acting out. The three most common door closers are anything that implies judgment, including your body language, the flag words that you use, or the idea that you begin giving advice, which takes us to number 2. Giving advice is one of the first things that staff people do, and it's one of the worst things that staff people do. And number 3 is reassuring people, especially when reassuring people comes in the form of something that may be dishonest. Telling people that everything is going to be okay when it quite possibly isn't going to be okay is not acceptable. Now, there's a difference between reassurance and assurance. Helping a person to know that you are there, helping them to become calm is a valuable thing to do. But telling people, I'll take care of it or it's all going to be okay is actually sometimes something that's going to backfire because it can be dismissive to an individual, and if you later on are wrong, then you're going to violate the trust that you have with that individual. The worst door slammer is interrupting the person. And there are 3 main problems with interrupting people. Number 1, we try to interrupt people to expedite conversations. we have this illusion that when we interrupt people, it's because we already know what they're going to say. We're saving time and being efficient by simply getting to the meat of the matter. But the truth of the matter is that because interruption communicates to the other person that we aren't listening, and because they don't know what the point was where you stopped listening, often they just start right from square one when it's their turn again. And so in other words, the conversation actually gets longer, not shorter. Number two, the conversation stops being about the original subject and inevitably becomes about the conversation itself. In other words, this is called meta-communication. And I'm sure this has happened to you many times in your life. You're talking about a circumstance with somebody that's close to you, and you interrupt, and they immediately say, "Let me finish," or "Why do you always do that?" or "Don't stop talking," or "Don't let me finish, and then you can talk." And those interruptions are extended by the person pausing to talk about the fact that we have to address how the conversation is going instead of what it's about. And the more interruptions that happen, the more of that meta communication we need to have. Thirdly, the speaker is going to likely give up on the communication, or as we said before, choose not to communicate with you again. So in your journal, please write for 8 minutes this time to describe the following. What are things that you typically do and say that show others you're interested in listening to them non-judgmentally? What are your door openers where you're skilled? And what things do you sometimes do that might communicate judgment or disinterest to others? Where are your door closers? Where do you need to focus? We're also going to get you to do another piece of work, and this is going to be a role play exercise. Please find another person, including somebody who's not doing this course, and have one person play the client, and you're going to be the listener. If you are in this class with somebody else, then play both roles, alternating and taking turns. As a client, you want the client simply to describe a recent frustrating or disappointing experience. It's better if it's a real thing. And the listener is simply going to use their feelor and summarizing skills to address that individual. They're not going to be giving advice. They're simply going to do the best they can to understand and to reflect back that they understand to the individual. So I want you, after you do that, to go back to your journal. What worked and where do you need to improve? In other words, you're testing what you wrote in the last journal entry, and you want to get feedback from the other person. What did they say worked? What did they think you could improve upon? And think about what benefit they might have had as a result of this. Ask them whether or not anything good came out of you simply being an active listener.